The day my mother called my husband a dirt-covered nobody was the same day he was quietly closing a deal that would make him worth more than everything my parents had ever owned combined.
She didn't know that.
Neither did my brother, who laughed so hard at dinner that night that he choked on his wine and had to be patted on the back. Neither did my father, who sat at the head of the table and just shook his head slowly, like he was embarrassed to even be in the same conversation. I knew. I'd known for almost 8 months. And I sat there at that dinner table, cutting my food slowly, and I didn't say a single word. Because Marcus had asked me not to. Not yet, he said. Just wait. And I had learned, over 12 years of marriage to that man, that when Marcus said wait, you waited. Let me start from the beginning, because if I just tell you the ending, you won't understand what it meant. You won't understand what it cost us to get there. You won't understand why, when the moment finally came, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired.
And free.
I met Marcus when I was 22 years old. I was home from college for the summer, staying with my parents in the suburb outside Columbus where I grew up. My mother had this whole plan mapped out for me: finish my business degree, come back, marry someone from the right family, work in my father's consulting firm, live in the right neighborhood, drive the right car, attend the right events. My mother had a list for everything. I was at a local farmer's market one Saturday morning, picking up tomatoes because my mother had sent me on an errand, and I knocked over an entire display of glass jar preserves at one of the stands. Just walked right into the corner of the table and sent about 12 jars of blackberry jam onto the concrete. The man behind the table didn't yell. He didn't make me feel stupid. He just got down on his knees and started picking up the glass, and he looked up at me and said, "You all right? Did any of it get on you?" That was Marcus. He had dirt under his fingernails and sunburn on the back of his neck, and the calmest brown eyes I'd ever seen. He made me help him sweep up, which I thought was fair, and then he gave me a free jar of the peach preserves and said I looked like I needed something sweet after a rough morning. I went back to that market 3 Saturdays in a row before I admitted to myself why. We dated for 2 years before I told my parents it was serious. I knew what was coming. I'd been preparing myself. But I think some part of me hoped they'd surprise me. That they'd see what I saw, this steady, brilliant, hardworking man who knew more about land and soil and growth cycles than most people with 3 degrees knew about anything. My mother's first question was, "What does he do exactly?" I told her he farmed. That he had about 200 acres he'd inherited from his grandfather, and that he was building it into something real. She looked at my father. My father looked at his coffee. And that was the beginning. They didn't come to our wedding. That's not a small thing to say. That's not a detail I throw in for dramatic effect. My parents did not attend my wedding. My mother said she had a migraine. My father said he had a work conflict that had come up last minute. My brother Daniel, 3 years older than me, always the star of the family, the one who'd done everything right by their standards, Daniel said he'd try to make it, but then sent a text the morning of saying something had come up. Something had come up. I stood at the front of a small outdoor ceremony on Marcus's land, surrounded by wildflowers and the smell of fresh earth and 100 people who genuinely loved us, and I cried. Not the happy kind. The kind you try to push back down so your mascara doesn't ruin the photos. Marcus saw it. He squeezed my hands and leaned in and whispered, "Their loss." And then we got married. For the first 3 years, I tried. I invited my parents to things. I called my mother every Sunday. I sent photos of the farm, of the new equipment Marcus had bought, of the crops coming in, of the little farmhouse we were fixing up together on weekends with our own hands. My mother would look at the photos and say things like, "It's very rustic." Or, "When are you two going to move somewhere proper?" Or, my personal favorite, Daniel just got promoted again. His bonus this year was," and then she'd say a number and look at me like she was waiting for me to feel something. I felt something, just not what she wanted. My father's approach was different. He didn't needle. He just treated Marcus like a piece of furniture. Looked past him during family gatherings. Directed every question to me. Never once asked Marcus about his work, his plans, his life. If Marcus spoke at dinner, my father would wait about 2 seconds and then redirect the conversation somewhere else entirely, like Marcus hadn't made a sound. Marcus never complained about it. That's the thing about him that I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain to people. He did not require their validation. It didn't feed him. He had his land, he had his work, he had me, and he had his vision. That was enough for him. It was not enough for me to watch it. But I loved him, so I said nothing. The mockery got worse after year 5. That was the year Marcus sold his first major harvest to a regional grocery chain, a real contract, real money, the kind of deal that took him 3 years of relationship building and product development to land. He came home that evening and lifted me off my feet in the kitchen. I told my parents about it at Easter dinner. My father raised his eyebrows and said, "Good. Maybe you two can finally afford a real house." My brother Daniel laughed. My mother said, "How long do you think that contract lasts? Those big companies drop local suppliers all the time." I stared at my plate. Marcus ate his dinner and didn't respond. On the drive home, I asked him how he could just sit there. He said, "Because I'm not trying to convince them of anything. They'll see it when it's time." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. Around year 7, something shifted on the farm that I wasn't fully paying attention to at the time. I was working remotely as a project manager for a logistics company. I'd built my own career quietly alongside Marcus's, and I was busy with deadlines and deliverables, and I trusted Marcus completely to run his end of things. But I noticed things. I noticed he was on the phone more. Not with me at the farm, with people I didn't recognize. I noticed he started taking trips to the state agricultural office. I noticed he hired a lawyer, not a farm lawyer, but a corporate attorney from Columbus, someone named Patricia Haynes who had a clean glass office and wore silk blouses and had a handshake that meant business. I asked Marcus about it one night. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and folded his hands and said, "I need you to trust me with something. I'm working on something big, really big, and I need it to stay quiet until I'm ready."
Can you do that?
I asked him what it was. He said, "Not yet. But I'll tell you this. Everything I'm building is in both our names. Every document, every asset, every structure. It's ours." "Okay." I said okay. And then I didn't ask again. In year 8, my parents came to the farm for the first time. It wasn't a social visit. My father's consulting firm had hit some trouble. I didn't know the details yet, but I noticed my mother calling more often, which usually meant something was wrong, and my brother Daniel had apparently convinced my parents to come and talk to Marcus about investment opportunities. I want to stop and let that sit for a second. The same people who had not come to my wedding. The same people who had spent 8 years treating my husband like an inconvenience. Who had sat at dinner tables and talked over him and made jokes about farmers and dirt and whether I was happy with my little rural life. Those people drove out to our farm on a Tuesday afternoon because they wanted something from us. Marcus met them in the driveway. He shook my father's hand. He kissed my mother on the cheek. He showed them around like they were honored guests. I stood on the porch and watched and felt something complicated I still can't name. My father talked around the subject for almost an hour before he finally got to the point. His firm was over-leveraged. They needed a short-term capital injection. He was wondering if Marcus had access to any liquid assets that might work as a bridge loan while they restructured. My father said the word loan like he was doing us a favor by asking. Marcus nodded slowly and said he'd think about it. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said he'd think about it. After they left, I asked Marcus what he was going to do. He said, "Nothing. Not right now." I said, "They need help." He said, "I know, but they don't know what we have yet. And I don't want them to find out like this." I still didn't fully understand. What happened next is the part that I think about the most, even now. 2 weeks after my parents' visit, my brother Daniel called me directly. He didn't call Marcus. He called me because I think he thought I was the easier target. And maybe I was once. But 8 years of watching my husband be quietly brilliant had changed me in ways I hadn't fully measured. Daniel said he needed to talk to me about the family situation. He said Dad's firm was in serious trouble and that the family needed to pull together. He said he personally had already put in $200,000 of his own savings and that he needed me to match it. I said, "Match it?" He said, "You and Marcus must have some equity in that land by now. You could refinance." And there it was. I had to be very careful in that moment, because I knew things that Daniel didn't know. And I knew that if I reacted the way I wanted to, if I said what I was thinking, it would unravel something that wasn't ready to be unraveled yet. So I said I'd talk to Marcus. Daniel said, "Don't let him talk you out of it. This is family." Like Marcus wasn't my family. Like the person I'd built everything with wasn't my family. I hung up the phone and sat in my car for about 15 minutes just breathing. That night, Marcus sat me down and told me everything. Not because I pushed, but because he said it was time. I'm going to try to explain this in a way that's clear because the business side of it is actually important to understanding why what happened later was so significant. Over the past 4 years, Marcus had not just been farming. He had been systematically acquiring land. Small parcels mostly, neighboring lots from families who were selling, foreclosure land from the bank, some acreage from a retiring farmer 2 counties over who liked Marcus and gave him a deal. He'd been quiet about it. He'd been patient. He'd structured everything through a holding company that Patricia Haynes had helped him set up, and he'd kept the filings low profile. The original farm, 200 acres, was now 1,200 acres. 1,200 acres of Ohio farmland, much of which sat directly adjacent to a new regional distribution corridor that had just been announced by the state. I stared at him. He pulled out a folder. There was a letter inside. From a development company out of Cincinnati. They wanted to buy 340 acres of our land for a logistics hub. The offer was, I had to read it twice, $14 million. For that portion alone. And Marcus had not responded yet. I said, "How long have you had this?" He said, "About 6 weeks." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because I wanted to have Patricia look at everything first. I wanted to understand all our options." And because he paused. He looked at me in that careful way he has. Because I knew your family was going to come asking for something. And I wanted to know where we stood before that conversation happened. Here is what I have to tell you about that moment, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, did Marcus do all of this to get revenge on my family? Was this some kind of long game to humiliate them?
No.
Marcus built what he built, because that's who Marcus is. He's a builder. He was always going to do this. My family's behavior wasn't the reason he succeeded. It was just the backdrop. It just happened to play out in a way where the timing meant something. But he was not naive. He knew exactly what was likely to happen when word got out. And he wanted to be ready. We did not give my father the bridge loan. Marcus wrote a short letter. Patricia helped him draft it, explaining that we were in a period of significant financial restructuring ourselves and were not in a position to extend personal loans at this time. Polite.
Clean.
No details. My father called me furious. He said Marcus had always been selfish. That Marcus had never cared about family. That this was exactly the kind of man he'd known Marcus was from the beginning. I asked my father when exactly he had considered Marcus family. He hung up. My mother texted me 3 times that week. The last one said, "I hope you're proud of yourself for choosing that man over your own blood." I showed Marcus the text. He read it. He put the phone down. He went outside and walked the back field, which is what he does when he needs to think. When he came back, he said, "Call your brother." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because Daniel is the only one in that family who might actually still be reachable. And because what I'm about to do is going to affect all of you, and I want to give him a chance first." I called Daniel. I don't know what I expected from that conversation. Maybe some version of my brother that remembered who I was. The sister he'd grown up with. The person he'd shared a childhood with. What I got instead was Daniel at his most corporate, calculating, transactional, reading the situation for what he could extract from it. He said he knew Marcus had the land. He said he'd done some digging and found the holding company filings. He said he knew about the development corridor. He said if Marcus was planning to sell to that Cincinnati company, the family deserved a portion of the proceeds given that our parents had helped establish my stability by providing housing and support during the early years of the marriage. I want to be precise about the timeline here. My parents had given me, not Marcus, me, a total of $6,000 over the course of our marriage. This was spread across 3 Christmases where my mother gave us checks because she felt guilty about not visiting. We had never asked for it. We had never borrowed it. It was not a loan. It was not an investment. It was a guilt-driven Christmas check. Daniel was now suggesting this constituted some form of financial claim on a $14 million land deal. I didn't respond to him in the moment. I said I'd have to think about it. I called Patricia Haynes the next morning. She already knew. Marcus had called her the night before. Here is where the story takes a turn that I did not see coming. And I was living it. Patricia told me that while she was doing due diligence on the development offer, she had discovered something about the land that the Cincinnati company had not yet fully accounted for. An agricultural research firm out of Michigan had been quietly acquiring access rights to farmland in exactly our region for a large-scale project they were taking to federal funding. She would not tell me more on the phone. She said we needed to come in. We drove to Columbus the next week. In Patricia's office, with a view of the skyline and coffee I was too nervous to drink, she laid it out. The research firm, I'll call them Green Axis, which is close enough, was in the process of securing backing for a sustainable agriculture initiative tied to a federal infrastructure grant. They needed anchor land with existing infrastructure, established soil history, and clear title. No disputes. No liens. No complications. Marcus's land fit every criteria. The Cincinnati Development Company was offering $14 million for 340 acres. Green Axis was interested in a long-term lease and partnership structure on the entire 1,200 acres that Patricia estimated, conservatively, could generate between $40 and $70 million over a 15-year horizon. And it wouldn't require us to sell. We could keep the land. We could keep the farm. And we could generate more money than my parents had ever imagined my dirt-covered husband was capable of. I looked at Marcus across the table. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just reading the document, like it was any other day, like this was just the next thing on the list. I thought about my mother calling him a nobody. I thought about my father looking past him at dinner. I thought about Daniel and his 2-second phone call the morning of our wedding. And then I took a breath and asked Patricia what the next steps were. The family gathering happened in September. I need to explain how this came about because it wasn't something we planned as a confrontation. Or, at least, it wasn't only that. My parents had organized a birthday celebration for my father's 65th birthday at their house. Big event. Extended family was coming. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my father's business partner and his wife, some of my mother's friends from their neighborhood association.
About 40 people.
My mother had been calling me for weeks about it. She alternated between guilt-tripping me about missing family events and sweetly asking whether Marcus and I would be attending. I noticed she was much warmer when she called and mentioned the party, more interested in how I was doing, asking if the farm was doing well. She had heard something. I didn't know exactly what, but she had heard something. We went. Marcus wore a clean blue button-down and clean boots, and he looked exactly like himself, which is to say he looked like a man completely comfortable in his own skin, which I have always found deeply attractive and which I know drove my mother quietly crazy. The evening started fine. Food, drinks, extended family catching up. My Aunt Paula, my father's sister, who I actually like, pulled me aside and said she'd heard things were going well for Marcus, and she was glad. That meant more to me than anything else that happened that night, actually. Then Daniel arrived. Daniel had clearly had something to drink before he got there. He was in that particular kind of mood, loud, expansive, backslapping, the life of the party, except with a current of aggression running underneath everything that I recognized from childhood. About an hour into the evening, when the party was at full volume and everyone was comfortable and slightly into their second glass of wine, Daniel walked up to where Marcus and my father were standing near the back patio. I was across the room. I could not hear the exact words, but I saw Daniel gesture broadly at Marcus. I saw my father shake his head slowly. I saw Daniel laugh. And then I saw Marcus's expression, which did not change, did not waver, completely still. I started moving toward them. By the time I was close enough to hear, Daniel was in the middle of telling a story to a small cluster that had formed around them. My father's business partner and his wife were there. My cousin Greg was there. My Aunt Paula had drifted over. Daniel was saying with full performance energy, "And I love the guy. I do. I genuinely love him for taking care of my sister." But let's be honest, right? We're family here. There's taking care of someone, and then she could have. And he laughed and looked at Marcus and said, "No offense, brother. You know I mean it with love. But my sister had options, you know? She made a choice, and we all supported it, even if some of us wondered what the plan was." He gestured around at the small crowd like they were all in on a shared joke. My Aunt Paula looked uncomfortable. My father's business partner looked at his wine. And then Marcus said, quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "What do you think the plan was, Daniel?" Daniel blinked. Something shifted in the air. Marcus wasn't hostile. He wasn't aggressive. He just asked the question like he genuinely wanted to know the answer. Like he had all the time in the world. Daniel started to say something about the farm, and what they'd all assumed about the farm, and how obviously things had turned out fine, which was great, really great. And Marcus reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. I had not known he was going to do this. He had not told me. And I want you to understand, I'm not saying he was wrong. I'm saying I was genuinely surprised. He pulled out a single folded piece of paper and handed it to my father's business partner. Not to my father, not to Daniel, but to this third party who was standing there with no stake in any of it, and said, "I was going to do this differently, but since we're talking about plans, would you mind reading what that says?" The man looked confused. He unfolded the paper. He read it. His eyebrows went up. He read it again. He said, "This is a letter of intent from Green Axis Agricultural." The name meant nothing to most people in that group. Marcus said, "It's a federal partnership. The first phase is valued at $22 million. The full structure runs to about 60. He said it the same way he would say the weather forecast. Clear. Measured. Just information. The silence was extraordinary. Daniel looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. My father looked at Marcus for the first time, and I mean the first time in 12 years of knowing each other, like he was actually seeing him. My mother had come out to the patio at some point.
I don't know exactly when.
But she was standing at the edge of the group, and her face had gone a color I'd never seen before. My Aunt Paula looked at me across the circle. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I just looked back at her. The evening deteriorated quickly after that. My father tried to redirect. He asked Marcus if this was something they could talk about privately, inside, just the family. Marcus said of course. We went inside. Daniel followed. My mother stood in the kitchen and kept touching things, the counter, the cabinet handle, her wine glass, like she needed something to hold on to. My father said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And there it was. That was the question. After 12 years, that was the whole question. Marcus looked at him, and he said, with no anger, no bitterness, just plain truth, "You never asked." And that was the moment my mother started crying. Not the guilty, processing kind of crying. The suddenly realizing kind. The kind that comes when you understand something you can't unfeel. My father sat down. Daniel said something about how they'd always respected what Marcus was building, which was so outrageous that my Aunt Paula, who had followed us inside, actually said out loud, "Daniel." Just his name. Nothing else. Daniel stopped talking. What happened over the next several weeks is what I think about when people talk about consequences. My father's firm did not survive its financial trouble. The bridge loan they'd been hoping for from us was not the only thing they needed. It turned out the problems ran deeper than a cash flow issue and involved some decisions my father's business partner had made that my father had either sanctioned or failed to catch. The firm closed in November. Daniel lost his job in March. His company had a round of layoffs, and he was in the second wave. His savings, the $200,000 he'd mentioned putting in to help my parents, turned out to have been an exaggeration. The real number was closer to $50,000, and a significant chunk of it had already been spent. My parents lost their house in the spring, not because of anything Marcus or I did, because the mortgage had been structured on the assumption that the consulting firm income would continue, and when it didn't, the math didn't work. They moved into a rental apartment about 20 minutes from where they'd spent 30 years building their version of the right life. I am not telling you this to make you feel good about their suffering. I want to be careful here because I think some people hear stories like this and they want the villain to suffer as punishment for what they did. I don't feel that way exactly. My parents are still my parents. I grew up in that house. Watching them lose, it was not satisfying. It was just sad. But I am also not going to pretend that I didn't think privately about all the years they'd spent building a hierarchy based on the right house, the right job, the right income, the right kind of husband, and how all of that had turned out to mean very little when things actually got hard. My mother called me in February. It was the first real conversation we'd had since the birthday party. We'd texted a few times, cautious, short messages checking in, but she hadn't called, and I hadn't called her. She called on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee in the kitchen. She said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to hear it and I need you to be honest with me." I said, "Okay." She said, "Do you hate us?" I thought about it honestly. I sat there for a moment with my coffee getting cold and I genuinely searched myself for the answer. I said, "No." She said, "Even after everything." I said, "It's not something I can choose, Mom. You're my family. I don't hate you." She was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "I owe Marcus an apology." I said, "You do?" She said, "A real one. Not a phone call. In person." I said I'd talk to him. I did talk to him. That same evening. Marcus was outside as usual. He was checking on a section of fencing that needed repair before spring. He was in his element, hands working, eyes calm, the land around him familiar and quiet. I stood next to him and told him about the call. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to have them over." He nodded. I said, "I know that's maybe." He said, "No, it's right. They're your family." I said, "They treated you badly." He said, "For years. And I'd like to think I'm a little bigger than that." They came in April. My parents, my brother Daniel, who had reached out separately, a halting, badly worded message that I chose to read as the best he could do, and my Aunt Paula, who asked if she could come and who I wanted there, because she was the one person in my family who had always moved through the world with her eyes open. We had dinner at the farmhouse. It was nothing fancy. Marcus made brisket that he'd started at 5 in the morning. I made my mother's own recipe for corn casserole, which I know sounds like a power move, but was genuinely the dish I know how to make that feels like a family meal to me. The table was set. The house was warm. The land outside the windows was green in that way it only gets in Ohio in April, when everything is coming back after winter. My parents walked in, and I watched my mother's face. She looked around slowly. At the house we'd built up over 12 years, the bookshelves, the photos, the repaired floors and the new windows and the kitchen we'd renovated one wall at a time. And then she looked out the window at the land. All of it. And I watched her understand what 12 years of quiet, patient, stubborn love and work had built. She said, "Oh, Rachel." That was all. My father shook Marcus's hand at the door. He held it for a moment and he said, "I'd like to apologize to you." Marcus said, "I know." He stepped back and let them in. Dinner was not a fairy tale. It was awkward. Daniel made some jokes that fell flat, and then stopped making jokes. My father ate in near silence for the first half of the meal, and then gradually began to thaw, asking Marcus questions I'd never heard him ask before. Real questions. About the soil, about the Green Axis partnership, about the decisions Marcus had made along the way. And Marcus answered him patiently, without any trace of victory in his voice. My Aunt Paula leaned over at one point and quietly said to me, "That man." I said, "I know." She said, "How did you find him at a farmer's market?" I said, "I knocked over his jam." She laughed quietly enough that only I heard it. After dinner, when Daniel had gone outside to get some air and my father and Marcus were still at the table talking, my mother found me in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and watched me for a moment. Then she said, "I made it very hard for you." I said, "You did." She said, "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I knew what a good life looked like, and I wanted that for you." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't see what was right in front of me." I turned to look at her. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow, without the house and the neighborhood, and the social scaffolding she'd built her identity around. I said, "He never needed your approval, Mom." But I did. She nodded slowly. She said, "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't say it was okay. Because it wasn't entirely okay, and she knew that, and I think saying so would have been a lie that neither of us needed. But I said, I'd like to try from here." And she said, "Me too." In May, the Green Axis Partnership was formally executed. Patricia Haynes and Marcus and I sat in a conference room in Columbus and signed documents that I still sometimes pull out and look at just to confirm they're real. The first phase, $22 million. The total structure, over 15 years, projected at somewhere between 55 and 63 million, depending on federal grant outcomes. The farmland, all 1,200 acres of it, is ours. We retain ownership. We retain farming rights on a significant portion. Marcus is actually a named consultant on the agricultural methodology component of the project, which tickled him in a way I found deeply endearing. We are not going to become people who forget where we came from. That is not a resolution I'm making for dramatic effect. It's just true. The farmhouse is still the farmhouse. Marcus still wakes up before 5 in the morning. I still work. We still argue about whether the kitchen needs to be repainted, and he still thinks it doesn't, and he is wrong. But the number is real, and so is what it represents. I want to tell you one more thing. A few months after the partnership signed, I found a box in the back of the closet in what used to be the spare bedroom. It was a box of things from before we were married, stuff I'd moved from my parents' house when I left. Inside the box was a birthday card my father had sent me when I turned 25. This was right after Marcus and I got together, right around the time I'd started telling my parents it was serious. In the card, my father had written, "I hope you're making wise choices. The foundation you build your life on matters. I love you." He'd meant it as a warning, a hint, a gentle nudge away from the farmer with dirt on his hands. I sat on the floor of that spare bedroom and read it twice. And then I thought about Marcus, down in the lower field, walking the land that he'd turned from 200 acres into 1,200. Walking the land that a federal program was now partnering with. Walking the land that had outlasted every dinner table insult and every wine-soaked laugh and every meaningful look passed between my parents across a table when they thought he wasn't watching. The foundation you build your life on matters. My father had been right. He just had no idea what foundation my husband was building. People ask me sometimes what the lesson is, what I took from all of it. I don't love the question, honestly, because I think it assumes the point of hard years is to extract a lesson from them, like they were a class you had to take. Like the 12 years were just the price of admission to the payoff. But if I have to say something, if I have to point to the thing I carry, it's this. Marcus never changed his behavior based on what my family thought of him. He didn't work harder to prove something to them. He didn't scale back because they made him feel small. He didn't become loud or defensive or bitter or desperate. He just kept building. Quietly. Patiently. With full confidence in the foundation. And in the end, the people who looked past him, who looked right through him as if he was invisible, were the ones who found themselves standing in his kitchen, at his table, eating the food he'd grown on the land he'd built, asking for a seat at the life he'd made.
And he pulled out the chair for them.
Because that's who Marcus is. That's who he's always been. And if I'm being fully honest with you, that's what I fell in love with at a farmer's market when I was 22 years old and knocked over his jam. Not the land. Not the money. Not the outcome. The man who got down on his knees to help me pick up the glass and then asked if I was okay. The rest was just the world finally catching up to what I already knew. The dirt-covered nobody built something worth $60 million. And the whole time, he never once needed them to believe in him. He just needed me to.